In the pantheon of Hollywood's singing cowboys, the names Gene Autry and Roy Rogers are etched in stone. But there was a third man, a quiet hero named Jimmy Wakely, whose success for a time burned just as brightly, if not more so. He starred in more than 24 of his own films, and with a voice as smooth as velvet, sold millions of records, achieving the rare feat of topping both the country and pop charts with massive hits that his more famous rivals rarely matched. So why is he the forgotten king? Why does a man who created a defining sound for post-war America now reside in the deep shadows of his peers? This is not a story of scandal or a tragic downfall. It is the story of a fascinating double life, the wholesome gentleman cowboy on screen, who became the king of controversial cheatin songs on the radio. It's the story of a star whose entire world, the B-movie Western, was utterly annihilated by the arrival of television. Above all, it's the story of the Western hero who sang for a nation and then had to find his voice all over again when the industry he mastered disappeared into the desert of changing times. To understand the man who would navigate this incredible rise and subsequent fade, we must begin where he did, not under the bright, forgiving lights of a Hollywood studio, but under the harsh, indifferent sun of the American South. James Clarence Wakely was born on February 16, 1914, in the tiny, unincorporated community of Mineola, Arkansas. To call his beginnings humble would be an understatement. This was not the romanticized, adventurous West of the movies he would one day star in. This was the hardscrabble, grinding reality of rural America in the early 20th century. His family were farmers, wresting a meager existence from the soil in a relentless cycle of planting and harvesting. Life was measured in seasons, in rainfall, and in the constant gnawing presence of economic precarity. The America of Jimmy's youth was a nation teetering on the edge of, and then plunging headlong into, the Great Depression. For families like the Wakeleys, the abstract headlines of stock market crashes and bank failures were felt in a deeply personal way, in the falling price of cotton, in the difficulty of securing credit for next year's seed, in the ever-present threat that one bad harvest could mean losing everything. It was a world of profound uncertainty and quiet desperation, a place where dreams were a luxury few could afford. In this environment, escape was not a recreational pursuit. It was a fundamental human need. And for millions, that escape came crackling through the air, carried on invisible waves into their modest homes. The proliferation of affordable, battery-powered radios in the late 1920s was a revolution. These magical boxes were windows into a wider, more exciting world. In the evenings, after a long day of back-breaking labor, families would gather around them, the faint glow of the dial illuminating their faces as they listened to voices from Chicago, Nashville, and New York. One voice in particular sliced through the static and captured the imagination of young Jimmy Wakely. It was a sound unlike any other, the lonesome, soulful yodel and earthy guitar of Jimmy Rogers, the singing brakeman. Rogers was America's first true country music star, a former railroad worker from Mississippi whose songs were authentic dispatches from the lives of the common man. He sang of ramblers, rounders, railroad men, and blue-hearted lovers. His voice was raw and untrained, but it possessed a powerful, almost primal emotional honesty. For a poor farm boy in Arkansas, listening to Rogers' famous blue yodel was a moment of profound revelation. It wasn't just music, it was a validation of his own world, a sign that the stories of ordinary struggling people were worthy of being turned into art. That sound lit a fire in him that the hardship of his daily life could not extinguish. He had to make music. With money scraped together from grueling farm labor, 50 cents a day for 10 hours of work, he sent away to a mail-order catalog. Weeks later, a parcel arrived. Inside was a guitar. It wasn't a fine instrument. It cost him a total of $3.95. But to Jimmy, it was everything. He dedicated every spare moment to it, his fingers, calloused from farm work, painstakingly learning the chords. He'd sit by the family radio and try to mimic the licks he heard, his ear his only guide. And then there was his voice. It became clear early on that he wasn't a vocal powerhouse in the traditional sense. He couldn't belt like a blues shouter or project like an opera singer. His gift was something more subtle. It was a voice of exceptional smoothness and clarity, imbued with an innate, almost conversational sincerity. It was a voice that didn't demand your attention, but rather invited you in. It was the voice of a trusted friend, a gentle confidant. While he worshipped Jimmie Rodgers, his own vocal stylings began to lean towards the smoother, more melodic delivery of the era's popular crooners, like Bing Crosby. Even then, an instinct was forming within him, a desire to blend the raw emotion of country with the polished accessibility of pop. But music, for now, remained a dream. The reality was a landscape of severely limited opportunity. He dropped out of school to help support his family, taking on any work he could find. He drove a coal truck. He picked cotton under the blistering Arkansas sun. He learned the value of hard work and the humility that comes from a life without a safety net. It was during this formative period, while playing a local gig, that he met a young woman named Dora Inez Miser, whom everyone called Ina. She was captivated by his gentle demeanor and his heartfelt singing. He was smitten with her beauty and kindness. Their courtship was simple and of its time, rooted in community gatherings and church socials. They married in 1935. Theirs would become one of Hollywood's most famously stable and enduring marriages, a quiet, unshakable anchor in the turbulent world he was about to enter. But in those early days, the future was a vast, unwritten page. The dream of a life in music seemed as distant and improbable as the shimmering lights of Hollywood. The first step on that long, uncertain road wasn't a glamorous audition, but a dusty move to a neighboring state that was becoming a surprising hotbed for a new and revolutionary kind of sound, Oklahoma. The decision to leave Arkansas was a monumental gamble. For a young married couple with little money and no connections, pulling up stakes was an act of pure faith. They chose Oklahoma, and specifically Oklahoma City, for a very good reason. In the mid-1930s, the state was the epicenter of a musical earthquake. Fueled by oil money and a unique cultural crossroads of Southern blues, Texas fiddle traditions, and big band jazz, a new genre was being born, Western swing. Bands led by charismatic innovators like Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys were creating a sound that was electrifying and danceable, and it was all happening on the radio. Oklahoma City was a radio town, and for an aspiring musician like Jimmy Wakely, the airwaves were the ultimate pathway to an audience. He arrived with his guitar, his wife, and a quiet but unshakable determination. Life was not easy. He took on odd jobs to make ends meet, but every spare moment was dedicated to music. He began to knock on the doors of local radio stations, seeking any opportunity, no matter how small. His persistence paid off when he landed a spot as a staff musician at WKY, one of the city's most powerful stations. This wasn't stardom. It was the grueling, unglamorous, and deeply formative work of a professional musician in the golden age of live radio. There were no retakes, no overdubs. Every performance was a high-wire act broadcast live to thousands of listeners. He played for hours a day in and day out. He had to learn hundreds of songs, from traditional folk ballads and gospel hymns to the latest pop hits and Western tunes. This relentless schedule was a crucible that forged him into a consummate professional. He developed an encyclopedic knowledge of music, honed his guitar skills, and learned how to connect with an unseen audience using nothing but his voice and a microphone. He learned about timing, pacing, and the subtle art of on-air patter. It was at WKY that he began to connect with other ambitious young musicians who shared his vision. He first formed a group called the Bellboys, which included a talented guitarist and songwriter named Johnny Bond, who would go on to his own successful career. They began to develop a reputation for their smooth sound and sophisticated arrangements. But Wakely was searching for something more refined. He eventually formed the Jimmy Wakely Trio, which featured two other singers, allowing them to create intricate three-part harmony arrangements. Their sound was a deliberate departure from the raw, raucous energy of many Western swing bands. It was polished, smooth, and deeply influenced by pop harmony groups like the Mills Brothers. They were musical craftsmen, and their tight, beautiful harmonies stood out on the airwaves. They became a local sensation. They were in high demand for live performances at dance halls, theaters, and community events all over the state. Jimmy Wakely was now a regional star, a big fish in the bustling pond of Oklahoma's music scene. He was making a living, supporting his family, and doing what he loved. For many, this would have been the pinnacle of success, but Wakely's ambitions, though quietly held, stretched far beyond the Oklahoma state line. He could hear the siren song of Hollywood, the place where country singers were being transformed into national heroes on the silver screen. Hen, one day in 1939, in a story that has become a part of country music lore, fate intervened. As the legend goes, Gene Autry, the undisputed king of the singing Cowboys and one of the biggest stars in the world, was on a personal appearance tour that brought him through Oklahoma City. In his hotel room between shows, he turned on the radio to get a feel for the local talent. What he heard was the impossibly smooth harmony of the Jimmy Wakely Trio. Autry possessed one of the sharpest ears in show business, not just for a catchy tune, but for talent that could be molded and integrated into his rapidly expanding entertainment empire. He heard in Wakely's clear, sincere lead, vocal, and the trio's polished backing a sound that was perfect for the more produced, nationally broadcast world of his own work. It was a sound that could appeal to audiences in New York and Chicago just as easily as it did in Tulsa. He immediately had his staff track the group down. A message was delivered to Jimmy Wakely. Mr. Autry wanted to see him. For Wakely, it was like a summons from Mount Olympus. He went to Autry's hotel room, nervous and starstruck. The biggest singing cowboy in the world was direct and to the point. He liked what he heard. He wanted to bring Wakely and his trio to California to be regular performers on his nationally broadcast CBS radio show, Melody Ranch. The offer was a staggering $75 a week for each of them. To a musician who had been surviving on intermittent radio paychecks and small-time gig money, it was a fortune. It was the chance of a lifetime, the fulfillment of a dream he had barely dared to speak aloud. There was no hesitation. Jimmy Wakely went home and told Ina the news. They would have to leave behind the life they had built, the friends they had made, and the security of his regional fame. They would be heading into the unknown, to the notoriously difficult and competitive world of Hollywood, a town known for breaking more hearts than it made stars. But it was a risk he had to take. He packed his guitar, and he and his family boarded a train heading west towards the California sun and a future that was both terrifying and thrillingly bright. The Oklahoma apprenticeship was over. He was about to step into the dream factory itself, unaware that he was on a path to not only work for its biggest cowboy star, but to one day become one himself. The journey west was more than just a trip across the country. It was the crossing of a threshold into another world. For Jimmy Wakely, the offer from Gene Autry was the validation of a dream that had been nurtured since he first heard a Jimmy Rogers yodel crackle through a radio speaker in rural Arkansas. But Hollywood does not crown its kings overnight. Stepping off that train was not an arrival at the finish line, but the beginning of a long and often humbling apprenticeship. He was about to learn that in the Dream Factory, talent alone is not enough. Survival requires patience, professionalism, and the resilience to live in the shadow of a giant before you can ever hope to command a spotlight of your own. The train that carried the Wakely family west in 1939 was more than just a mode of transportation. It was a vessel crossing the vast gulf between two entirely different Americas. They were leaving behind the familiar, close-knit world of Oklahoma, a place where Jimmy had built a name for himself through sheer persistence and talent. They were heading towards a dream, a shimmering mirage on the horizon that promised fame and fortune, but offered no guarantees. For Jimmy, Ina, and their children, the arrival in Los Angeles was a profound culture shock. The scale of it all was overwhelming. This wasn't the folksy, accessible entertainment community of Oklahoma City. This was the global epicenter of glamour, power, and illusion, a city teeming with hopefuls from every corner of the country, all convinced they were destined for stardom. Their new life was centered around the CBS Lux Radio Theater on Vine Street, the home of Gene Autry's national radio powerhouse, The Melody Ranch Show. Every week, millions of Americans tuned in. The show's broadcast sponsored by the ubiquitous Wrigley's Spearmint Gum. For many families, it was a Sunday ritual, a dose of wholesome musical escapism. The show was a perfectly calibrated machine, a mixture of comedy sketches, Western drama, and of course music, all built around the magnetic personality of its star. For Jimmy Wakely and his trio, their role in this machine was well-defined but subordinate. They were the musical scaffolding that supported the main structure. They were the house band, the vocal equivalent of the wrecking crew. Their job was to provide the lush, polished harmonies that backed up Gene Autry on his numbers and to perform their own songs during the interludes, warming up the crowd for the main event. It was a prestigious gig, a national platform that brought his voice into homes from coast to coast. But it also firmly established his place in the Hollywood hierarchy. He was a supporting player, a gifted sideman in the court of the king. This period became Wakely's long and invaluable Hollywood apprenticeship. He was a quiet and observant student, and his classroom was the studio itself. He watched his boss, Gene Autry, with intense focus, absorbing lessons that could never be taught in a textbook. He saw how Autry, beneath his easygoing, folksy demeanor, was a master businessman. Autry understood his own brand better than anyone. He meticulously managed his image, controlled his career, and diversified his interests, investing in everything from radio stations to baseball teams. He was a one-man conglomerate, a model of artistic and financial independence that Wakely would never forget. He also learned the art of connecting with an audience on a mass scale. He saw how Autry could read a line or sing a phrase with a particular kind of sincerity that made every listener feel like he was performing just for them. It was a form of mass intimacy, and it was the secret to his phenomenal success. Wakely, a naturally sincere performer himself, studied and internalized this, refining his own delivery and stage presence. Soon, Autry decided to bring his radio trio into his other domain, the movies. Republic Pictures, where Autry was the reigning king, was a factory for B-Westerns. These weren't the epic A-list productions of a John Ford. They were fast, efficient, and wildly profitable films made for the seemingly insatiable appetite of small-town America. Wakely's first on-screen appearances were so minor they were often uncredited. He was quite literally musical set dressing. In films like 1939's Saga of Death Valley or 1941's Heart of the Rio Grande, he's there, a youthful face in Autry's posse or a ranch hand in the bunkhouse. The plot would pause and the director would call for a song. Jimmy and his trio would step forward, deliver a perfectly harmonized number, and then recede back into the scenery as the plot and the fistfights resumed. The experience, while not creatively fulfilling, was another crucial part of his education. It demystified the process of filmmaking. He saw how the sausage was made, learning the technical aspects of lighting, sound, and camera angles. He learned how to hit his marks, how to act natural in front of a camera, and how to perform a song in short, disconnected takes that would later be stitched together in an editing room. He was learning the craft of the movie business from the ground up, all while collecting a steady paycheck that provided a level of security he had never known. Parallel to his work with Autry, he pursued his own recording career, signing a contract with Decca Records in 1940. This should have been his chance to establish a separate artistic identity. But the early records were largely extensions of the work he was already doing. They were well-made, pleasant cowboy and western songs, often featuring his trio's smooth harmonies. They sold respectably to the existing fan base of the genre, but they failed to break out. The sound was generic, lacking the distinctive personality and emotional depth that would later define his greatest work. He was still finding his voice, not just literally, but artistically. In the vast and crowded marketplace of popular music, he was still just one of Gene Autry's guys. For nearly 3 years, this was his life, a comfortable, stable, yet ultimately frustrating existence in the long shadow of his mentor. He was working constantly, his name was known, but he was not yet a star in his own right. He was waiting for a break, a chance to step into the spotlight. He could not have known that this break would come as a result of a global catastrophe that would change the world and Hollywood forever. On December 7th, 1941, the insulated world of Hollywood was shattered, along with the rest of the nation. The attack on Pearl Harbor and America's subsequent entry into World War II sent a shock wave through the film industry. The Dream Factory was abruptly retooled for the war effort. Studios began producing training films and patriotic propaganda. More significantly, Hollywood's biggest leading men traded their screen costumes for military uniforms. Stars like Clark Gable, James Stewart, and Henry Fonda enlisted, driven by a sense of patriotic duty. In the world of the B-Western, the biggest star of all made a decision that stunned the industry. Gene Autry, who was at the absolute zenith of his fame and earning power, voluntarily enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps. On his Melody Ranch radio show during a live broadcast in July 1942, he was sworn into the service. For his millions of fans, it was a heroic, inspirational act. For his studio, Republic Pictures, it was a corporate disaster. They had just lost their most valuable asset, the man whose films were a guaranteed source of massive profits. A power vacuum had opened at the very top of the Western genre, and the studio scrambled to fill it. Logically, one might have expected them to turn to Jimmy Wakely. He was, after all, Autry's direct protege, a regular on his radio show and in his films. He had the musical talent, the on-screen experience, and the wholesome image. He was the heir apparent. But the studio bosses at Republic saw things differently. They were looking for a carbon copy of Autry, but perhaps with a little more flash and youthful energy. They looked through their roster of contract players, and their eyes landed on another handsome young singer who had been toiling away in supporting roles. A man named Leonard Sly, who now went by the screen name Roy Rogers. Rogers had a different energy than Wakely. Where Jimmy was reserved and gentle, Roy was athletic and charismatic, with a dazzling smile and a flair for showmanship. Republic put the full force of its marketing machine behind him, billing him as the new King of the Cowboys. They teamed him with the brilliant Palomino stallion Trigger, gave him a feisty leading lady in Dale Evans, and surrounded him with a colorful cast of sidekicks. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Roy Rogers became an even bigger star than Autry had been. His films were more action-packed, his costumes more ornate, his songs more upbeat. He was the perfect hero for a nation at war, a symbol of optimistic, all-American dynamism. And where was Jimmy Wakely in all of this? He was still there, on the sidelines. He continued to appear in films, including some of Roy Rogers' early pictures. He was watching a man with a similar background, another singing cowboy from the supporting ranks, skyrocket to the kind of fame he had only dreamed of. It must have been a profoundly difficult and disillusioning period to be so close to the prize, to be the logical successor only to be passed over, had to sting. There is no record of him ever complaining publicly. His professionalism and quiet dignity would not allow it. But privately, he must have wondered if his chance would ever come. He was approaching 30, an age where Hollywood careers were often made or broken. He was in danger of becoming a permanent sideman, a footnote in the careers of other, more famous men. The shadow he lived in had only grown larger. But the departure of Autry and the ascension of Rogers had an unintended consequence. With Republic Pictures pouring all its resources into its new king, the other, smaller studios saw an opportunity. The demand for westerns was higher than ever, and there was now room in the market for more than one or two big names. The so-called Poverty Row studios, the scrappy low-budget production houses that churned out films for the bottom half of double bills, were looking for their own singing cowboy heroes. One of the most prominent of these was Monogram Pictures. They couldn't compete with Republic's budgets or production values, but they were experts at making popular, profitable films quickly and cheaply. They needed a star, but they couldn't afford an established one. They needed someone with name recognition, proven talent, and a solid work ethic who was being undervalued by the major players. They needed Jimmy Wakely. Monogram Pictures was the king of the B producers. They didn't make art, they made product, and they were brilliant at it. Their business model was simple. Identify what the public wanted and give it to them in a reliable, affordable package. In the mid-1940s, the public wanted singing cowboys. With Gene Autry at war and Roy Rogers locked down at Republic, Monogram's chief executive, Scott R. Dunlap, saw a golden opportunity. He began searching for a leading man to headline his studio's own series of musical westerns. His search led him to Jimmy Wakely. Here was a performer who was already a known quantity to Western fans across the country. He had a nationally recognized voice from the Melody Ranch show and years of on-screen experience. He was handsome, professional, and most importantly, he was available and affordable. For Wakely, the offer from Monogram was a lifeline. It was the chance he had been waiting for through all the years of standing in the background. It wasn't Republic Pictures, the big leagues, but it was a starring role. It was the opportunity to finally have his name above the title. He signed the contract in 1944. The long apprenticeship was officially over. His first starring vehicle was titled Song of the Range. The pressure on him was immense. An entire film series and the financial investment of a studio was now resting squarely on his shoulders. The production process at Monogram was a whirlwind. There was no time for artistic indulgence. Scripts were written to a strict formula, and films were often shot in a week or less on dusty, sun-baked ranches in the San Fernando Valley that served as the stand-in for the entire American West. From the very beginning, a conscious decision was made to craft an on-screen persona for Wakely that would set him apart from his competitors. If Autry was the shrewd, fatherly figure and Rogers was the flashy, athletic hero, Wakely would be something different. He would be the gentleman cowboy. His character was consistently written as being calmer, more thoughtful, and less prone to violence than his rivals. He was the hero who would prefer to talk his way out of a problem, using reason and decency before resorting to his fists. Of course, he could handle himself when the time came, but his primary weapon was his innate goodness. This persona was a perfect fit for Wakely's own quiet, real-life personality, and it made him relatable. Audiences, particularly mothers who were sending their children to the Saturday matinees, saw him as a safe, dependable, and admirable role model. He was paired with the veteran character actor dubbed Cannonball Taylor as his comedic sidekick, and the formula was set. For the next 5 years, Jimmy Wakely would be one of Monogram's most reliable and hardest-working stars. He had finally stepped out of the shadows. As he stood on the set of Song of the Range, the lights bearing down on him, the camera focused solely on his face, he was no longer Gene Autry's harmony singer or a background player in a Roy Rogers picture. He was the star. The years of patience, professionalism, and quiet determination had finally paid off. He had his shot at the top. The question now was, what would he do with it? Stepping into the spotlight as the star of his own series was the culmination of a decade of patience and quiet determination. After years of standing in the background, Jimmy Wakely had finally been given the chance to prove himself. But the reality of B-movie stardom was less about the glamour of fame and more about the relentless pace of a cinematic assembly line. He was about to become a workhorse, a dependable hero for a nation that craved simple morality. And yet, even as he mastered the demands of this new role, a parallel career was taking shape in the state-of-the-art recording studios of Capitol Records, a career that would challenge his wholesome image, redefine his legacy, and make him a bigger star than the movies ever could. With the signing of his Monogram Pictures contract, Jimmy Wakely's years of waiting in the wings were definitively over. He had been handed the keys to his own cinematic kingdom, and he proved to be a diligent and reliable ruler. Life as a B-Western star, especially at a factory like Monogram, was a relentless grind. The glamour of a Hollywood premiere was a world away from the day-to-day reality of production. The pace was punishing. Wakely and his dedicated crew would churn out 6 to 8 feature films a year, a staggering workload by any standard. Each film was typically shot in a mere 5 to 7 days, a testament to the ruthless efficiency of the Poverty Row system. There was no time for artistic temperament or multiple takes. The scripts were formulaic, the sets were recycled, and the locations were almost always the same sun-baked ranches and rock formations of the San Fernando Valley, just a short drive from the studio. Yet within these rigid constraints, Wakely thrived. He was a consummate professional, always prepared, always hitting his marks, and always delivering the quiet charisma that was fast becoming his trademark. The films themselves were pillars of the B-Western formula. Titles like Saddle Serenade, Lonesome Trail, and Ridin' the River became beloved staples of Saturday matinees in small towns across America. In each one, Wakely, as the hero, would ride into a community plagued by corruption, outwit the black-hatted land grabbers or crooked bankers, save the wholesome heroine without so much as a kiss, and, of course, pause 3 or 4 times to sing a song. A key to the success of the series was the on-screen family he built around him. His primary sidekick was the portly and perpetually befuddled dub cannonball Taylor, a veteran comedian whose slapstick antics provided the perfect counterpoint to Wakely's straight-laced heroism. Their easy chemistry felt genuine and provided much of the film's warmth and humor. This on-screen world was populated by a rotating cast of familiar faces, dependable character actors who specialized in playing grizzled sheriffs, loyal ranch hands, and sneering villains. It was a self-contained universe, comforting in its predictability. What truly set the Jimmy Wakely series apart, however, was the careful cultivation of his gentleman cowboy persona. His films were noticeably less violent than many of their contemporaries. The emphasis was less on fistfights and shootouts and more on community, decency, and common sense. Wakely's hero was an approachable figure, a man who solved problems with his wits and his innate integrity. He was a comforting presence, a symbol of quiet, dependable strength in a nation that was just emerging from the collective trauma of World War II. He wasn't the rugged, solitary myth of John Wayne. He was the friendly neighbor who would help you fix your fence and then sing you a song. This persona resonated powerfully with audiences. Polls of movie exhibitors consistently ranked him among the top 10 most popular Western stars, year after year. For Monogram Pictures, he was a goldmine. His films a guaranteed return on their modest investment. He had achieved a level of stardom that must have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. He was a king, but it was a kingship with clearly defined borders. He was the ruler of the B-Western, a genre that, even in its heyday, was viewed by the Hollywood establishment as the cinematic equivalent of a pulp novel. He had a loyal and massive audience, but it was an audience that existed far from the glitzy mainstream. But even as his film career solidified, a revolution was brewing in the other half of his professional life, a revolution that would shatter the boundaries of his B-movie kingdom and launch his voice into a completely different stratosphere. While Jimmy Wakely, the movie star, was churning out westerns for Monogram, Jimmy Wakely, the recording artist, was growing increasingly restless. His contract with Decca Records had yielded a string of pleasant but unremarkable cowboy songs that did little to showcase the true quality of his voice. In 1947, he made the single most important business decision of his career. He left Decca and signed with Capitol Records. This was more than just a change of labels. It was a wholesale reinvention. Capitol was the new powerhouse on the West Coast, a label known for its ambition, its impeccable roster of pop and jazz artists like Peggy Lee, Nat King Cole, and Frank Sinatra, and its legendary recording quality. Capitol's producers, men like the visionary Lee Gillette, saw something in Wakely that others had overlooked. They heard past the cowboy yodels and the Western trappings and recognized a voice of pure gold, a smooth, intimate, and technically flawless baritone that was, in essence, the voice of a classic pop crooner. Their plan was audacious: to strip away the Western from his sound and market him as a country pop balladeer. The transformation was immediate and profound. They encouraged him to drop the more overt country mannerisms in his singing, smoothing out any rough edges. They surrounded his voice not with the typical fiddles and steel guitars of Western swing, but with sophisticated modern arrangements that often included lush string sections, backing vocal groups, and the subtle jazz-inflected playing of Hollywood's finest session musicians. They were creating a new genre in real time, a polished uptown version of country music that would later be dubbed countrypolitan. They were building a bridge from the honky-tonk to the supper club. The first major result of this new direction was a song that would change his life forever. In 1948, he recorded a heartbreaking ballad of marital regret called "One Has My Name, the Other Has My Heart." The song, written by the singing cowboy actor Eddie Dean and his wife, was lyrically daring for its era. It was an unflinching first-person account of a man trapped in a loveless marriage, his heart belonging to another woman. Wakely's performance was a revelation. He sang it not with overwrought emotion, but with a quiet, devastating sincerity. The pain in his voice was palpable, the delivery intimate and confessional. It felt less like a performance and more like overhearing a private, sorrowful thought. Capitol Records knew they had a monster hit on their hands and promoted it heavily. The public reaction was explosive. The record shot to #1 on the Billboard country charts and stayed there for an astonishing 11 weeks. But that was only half the story. In a rare feat for a country artist at the time, the song crossed over, climbing into the top 10 of the national pop charts. It was a bona fide phenomenon. Suddenly, Jimmy Wakely wasn't just a B-movie cowboy. He was one of the biggest recording stars in America. His voice was everywhere, on the radio in New York, on jukeboxes in Chicago, in living rooms in Los Angeles. He had achieved a level of musical success that had eluded his on-screen rivals, Autry and Rogers. The executives at Capitol, eager to capitalize on this momentum, then came up with a stroke of marketing genius. They decided to pair their new country crossover king with one of their biggest pop queens, the beloved singer Margaret Whiting. The result of their collaboration was a song that would become even bigger and far more controversial than One Has My Name. It was a deceptively John Lee tune called Slippin' Around. If One Has My Name was a song of regret, Slippin' Around was a brazen celebration of infidelity. Written as a duet, the lyrics depicted two married lovers cheerfully planning their clandestine meetings, rationalizing their affair with the simple, catchy refrain, "Though I'm tied to another, I'll be yours for a while. It's my fault, it's your fault, for we're slipping around." In the socially conservative climate of 1949, the song was an absolute scandal. Religious groups condemned it. Social critics decried its moral laxity. Some radio stations, fearing listener backlash, refused to play it. And the public, of course, could not get enough of it. The whiff of controversy only fanned the flames of its popularity. The song became a national obsession. It flew to the #1 spot on the country charts, and incredibly also hit #1 on the mainstream pop charts, an almost unheard of achievement. The follow-up duet with Whiting, I'll Never Slip Around Again, promptly did the same. Jimmy Wakely was now living a truly charmed life. He was a movie star by day and a chart-topping, boundary-pushing recording artist by night. He had successfully conquered two separate worlds of entertainment, a feat few have ever managed. But in doing so, he had created a deep and fascinating contradiction at the very heart of his public identity. By 1949, there were, in effect, two Jimmy Wakeleys coexisting in the American consciousness. There was Jimmy the Gentleman Cowboy, the unimpeachable hero of the Saturday matinee, a role model for the nation's children, who always upheld the highest moral standards. And then there was Jimmy the Crooner, the sophisticated singer whose voice filled the airwaves with adult tales of broken hearts and illicit love affairs. The conflict was obvious and potent. How could the man who represented the simple black and white morality of the B-Western also be the voice behind country music's most famous cheatin' song? For his part, Wakely seemed to navigate this duality with his characteristic calm. He understood the separation between character and artist. The cowboy was a role he played, a part of the entertainment business. The singer was a storyteller, giving voice to complex human emotions, however uncomfortable they might be. Fortunately for him, the public seemed to agree. Audiences proved themselves more than capable of holding these two conflicting ideas at once. They could cheer for the hero on Saturday afternoon and then slow danced to his heartbreaking ballad on Saturday night without seeing any hypocrisy in it. He was at the absolute apex of his fame. A successful movie career, a string of #1 records, a national radio show, and a beloved public image. From the outside, it seemed as though his ascent was unstoppable, his position in the show business firmament secure. He had it all. But even as he stood at this dizzying peak, surveying the landscape of his success, the ground beneath his feet was beginning to tremble. A new technology, a flickering electronic box, was quietly making its way into American living rooms. It was called television. And it was about to unleash a tidal wave of change that would wash away the entire world of the B-movie Western, and with it, the foundations of his cinematic kingdom. By 1949, Jimmy Wakely was living a double life of unprecedented success. He was the gentleman cowboy, a beloved hero to millions of children, and simultaneously the sophisticated country crooner, a chart-topping sensation whose voice told mature stories of heartbreak and desire. He stood at the apex of the entertainment world, a master of two distinct domains, but the industry is one of constant, ruthless change. And at the very moment of his greatest triumph, a flickering light was appearing in living rooms across the nation, an invention that would not only challenge his career, but would bring the entire world he represented as a movie star to a sudden and dramatic end. The sun was about to set on the singing cowboy. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, a new kind of magic was invading American homes. It was an electronic box that could conjure moving pictures out of thin air. Television, once a novelty for the wealthy, was becoming a household staple with breathtaking speed. This new technology promised a future of boundless entertainment and connection, but for a certain corner of the Hollywood dream factory, it was an angel of death, and its primary victim was the B-Western. The business model that had sustained studios like Monogram Pictures was simple: produce a high volume of low-budget films for a captive audience that flocked to small-town theaters every weekend. Television attacked this model from two directions. Firstly, it offered a seemingly endless supply of Western content for free. Early TV schedules were filled with the repackaged B-Westerns of the 1930s, giving stars like Hopalong Cassidy a massive second wave of fame. Soon, original Western series like The Lone Ranger and The Cisco Kid began to dominate the airwaves, offering children the same heroic adventures they once had to pay to see at the Saturday matinee. Why would a family spend money at the cinema when they could have the Wild West delivered directly to their living room? The economic impact was swift and brutal. The small, independently owned theaters that were the lifeblood of the B-Western industry began to close their doors by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The audience was no longer there. For the studios on Poverty Row, it was a death sentence. In 1949, at the very peak of his recording fame, Jimmy Wakely received the news from Monogram Pictures. Despite his consistent popularity and the profitability of his films, the studio was shutting down his series. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic falling out. It was a cold, hard business decision. The assembly line was being dismantled because the demand for the product had evaporated overnight. For Wakely, the end was shockingly abrupt. He had worked tirelessly for 5 years, building a beloved on-screen persona and a loyal fan base, only to see the entire infrastructure that supported his film career crumble into dust. He would make a handful of other pictures in the early 1950s, but they were the last embers of a dying fire. The genre was breathing its last, and with it, his time as a movie star was over. He was still a young man, not yet 40 years old, but an entire chapter of his life, The chapter that had brought him to Hollywood and made him a household name had been slammed shut. He was now a king without a kingdom, a cowboy hero in a world that no longer had a place for him on its screens. The question that faces every star whose spotlight suddenly goes dark was now his to answer. What do you do next? The history of Hollywood is littered with the tragic stories of stars who could not cope with the loss of fame. For many, the end of a film career marked the beginning of a long, slow fade into bitterness, obscurity, or self-destruction. Jimmy Wakely was not one of them. His response to the collapse of his movie career was not to despair, but to adapt. Grounded by his unshakable family life with his wife Ina and their children, and possessed of a farmer's pragmatism, he simply rolled up his sleeves and got back to work. With the movie sets gone, he returned to his first and truest love, the music. He leaned into the fame his hit records had brought him and became a full-time touring musician. This was not the glamorous life of a Hollywood star. It was the grueling, unglamorous, but honest life of a road warrior. Throughout the 1950s and into the 60s, he was a relentless presence on the American touring circuit. He played everywhere and anywhere. The grandstands at state fairs, the stages of smoky casino lounges in the burgeoning cities of Las Vegas and Reno, the auditoriums in countless small towns where his name and voice still meant something special. He was a consummate professional. His shows a polished mix of his chart-topping ballads, his cowboy movie songs, and his easy homespun charm. But even here, in the world of music that had once been his unassailable fortress, the ground was shifting again. The smooth, crooning country pop sound he had helped to pioneer was being challenged by new, more aggressive sounds. From one side came the raw, rebellious energy of rock and roll, a tidal wave of youth culture that made his gentle ballads seem quaint. From the other side, within country music itself, the slick, string-laden Nashville sound was becoming the dominant commercial force. His brand of sophisticated West Coast country polity began to sound dated. By the mid-1950s, his string of hit records had dried up. He was now facing the specter of professional obsolescence on two fronts. Faced with a film industry that no longer wanted him and a music industry that was rapidly moving on, Jimmy Wakely made the most remarkable move of his career. Instead of accepting his fate as a nostalgia act, he took control of his own destiny. In the late 1950s, he founded his own record company, Shasta Records. In an era when artists were almost completely beholden to the whims of major labels, this was a pioneering, almost revolutionary act of independence. Shasta Records was a brilliant two-pronged strategy for survival and preservation. Firstly, it became the vehicle for curating his own legacy. He shrewdly acquired the rights to many of his classic Capitol recordings and began to re-release them on Shasta, ensuring that his most important work would remain available to the public and, crucially, under his control. He did the same with his old Monogram movies, buying the rights and syndicating them to the very television stations that had once rendered them obsolete. He was turning his past into a viable business for the future. Secondly, Shasta became a haven for his friends and contemporaries, other great artists from the golden age of country and Western music who had been cast aside by the mainstream. He signed and recorded legends like Tex Ritter, Merle Travis, and his old bandmate Johnny Bond. He was creating an ark, a place where the music and the artists he loved could be safe from the changing tides of popular taste. He built his own recording studio, ran his own music publishing company, and transformed himself from a performer into a respected producer, executive, and elder statesman. He had lost his movie career and his place on the charts, but in the process he had found something perhaps more lasting: true independence. When we look back at the totality of Jimmy Wakely's life and career, his true significance becomes clear. He was more than just a forgotten star. He was a pivotal, if often overlooked figure in the evolution of American popular music and a symbol of a bygone era in the entertainment. His most profound legacy lies in his role as a musical bridge. Long before the term crossover was common parlance, he was one of its most successful practitioners. With his smooth, sophisticated vocal style and the lush, pop-inflected arrangements of his capital hits, he made country music accessible to a vast mainstream audience. He, along with contemporaries like Eddie Arnold, sanded down the genre's rough rural edges and presented it as a form of elegant adult storytelling. He proved that a song born of the honky-tonk could find a home in the classiest supper clubs, paving the way for generations of future crossover artists, from Glenn Campbell and Kenny Rogers all the way to the pop country superstars of today. Culturally, his film career serves as a perfect time capsule. He was one of the last great kings of the B-Western, and his story is inextricably linked to the life and death of that uniquely American art form. His movies represent the final flowering of a certain kind of innocent, morally unambiguous entertainment that vanished with the rise of television and a more cynical age. To watch a Jimmy Wakely film today is to step back into a simpler world, a world of clear-cut heroes and straightforward virtues that he embodied with a quiet, powerful sincerity. And then there is his personal legacy, a story of dignity, resilience, and professionalism. In an industry notorious for its casualties, he endured. His nearly 50-year marriage to his beloved Ina, his stable family life, and his complete lack of scandal stand in stark contrast to the turbulent lives of so many of his peers. When the spotlights moved on, he didn't chase after them. He simply built his own, smaller lights and went about the business of preserving the work that mattered to him. He was a survivor, not through aggression or ego, but through quiet intelligence and a deep-seated sense of his own worth. Jimmy Wakely passed away from emphysema in 1982 at the age of 68. He was a beloved husband, father, and grandfather. During his lifetime, he was never inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, an oversight that his fans and many music historians still consider a profound injustice. However, he was posthumously honored with induction into the Western Music Association Hall of Fame in 1991, a fitting recognition for his immense contribution to the genre. In the grand narrative of the singing Cowboys, his name is often relegated to a footnote, overshadowed by the brighter, more durable legends of Autry and Rogers. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning: why is he so often forgotten? The answer, perhaps, is that his virtues were quiet ones. His career was tied to a cinematic world that vanished completely, and his musical style was a bridge, a beautiful, essential bridge, but one that is often less celebrated than the destinations it connects. He was not a revolutionary who burned brightly and flamed out. He was an evolutionist, a master craftsman whose influence was subtle but deep. The story of Jimmy Wakely is not a tragedy. It is not a tale of what might have been. It is a story of what was, a remarkable journey from the cotton fields of Arkansas to the heights of Hollywood, and then a graceful navigation of the long, quiet years that followed. He wasn't the mythical cowboy who rode off into a technicolor sunset. He was the real man who had to figure out how to build a life after the sun had already set on his world. His story is a powerful lesson in adaptation, dignity, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, dedicated to family, business, and the simple, honest beauty of a song. The fame may have faded, and the films may gather dust, but the voice, that pure, sincere, and gentle voice, remains. It waits patiently in the grooves of old records, a timeless echo from the heart of a gentleman.